Hello again, and welcome to the latest in a series of online video lessons intended to provide you important principles and handy tips to advance your understanding and practice of argumentation. This is the second in a two-part series on claims and propositions. Claims are one of the three fundamental building blocks of any argument, and propositions are those main claims that define the parameters of an entire debate or controversial dispute. In the first part of this series, we focused on the important In the first part of this series, we defined claims and propositions, and we talked about how the proposition is important in defining the entire anatomy of a dispute. In this part of the two-part series, we're going to focus on the criteria for arguable propositions. Because the framing of the proposition is so important to determine what issues need to be discussed in order to resolve a dispute, as well as to allocate the responsibilities between those who are supporting or opposing a proposition, we need to make sure that these propositions are framed the right way. And so we're going to deal with the four primary standards for developing those propositions: controversiality, clarity, balance, and challenge. Okay, let's get started. As we discussed earlier, the type of claim that's being established is going to be really important in order for us to get a sense of what the primary issues are that need to be discussed in order to determine whether or not that claim is true or not. And so you can imagine then, if the claim is not framed in the right sort of way, it could really have negative consequences for how the rest of the argument or discussion or debate is going to play out. That's why we need to think about the criteria for arguable claims. In other words, what are the standards by which we can say this claim is going to be adequate and sufficient to frame a larger debate? And so the criteria or standards for claims that we can argue are four: controversiality, clarity, balance, and challenge. Let's take them one at a time. Controversiality essentially gets at whether or not a claim states a position that is not currently accepted or adhered to by the audience. In other words, controversiality is about something that people can actually disagree on. Because if you don't have a context of disagreement, then you don't have a reason to argue. So, for instance, take this example regarding capital punishment. Capital punishment, or the death penalty, ensures that a murderer can never murder again. Now, if you take a look at this claim, we know that it's got a problem with regard to controversiality because of this language: ensures that a murderer can never murder again. Well, yeah, that's just intrinsically true. If you take a murderer and you kill them, they can't ever murder anybody ever again. Nobody, even opponents of capital punishment, would disagree with that statement because it's just true, right? So there's no controversiality here. By contrast, take the following example. Capital punishment deters violent crime. It's a proposition of fact, just like the previous proposition, but this one includes this language, deters violent crime, that actually involves disagreement. There are lots of folks that argue that capital punishment does provide a significant disincentive to people to commit certain violent crimes. And there are others that argue that no, in fact, the death penalty does not provide that kind of disincentive because it doesn't actually prevent people from making the decision to engage in these violent crimes. So you can actually have disagreement over whether or not the statement is true or false. That's what controversiality is all about. Now, the second criteria is clarity. Clarity involves how well a claim focuses arguments on a particular set of issues within particular parameters. When we think about clarity, we generally think about the ways in which the language is being used. So can we understand it? Is the statement clear? But from an argumentation standpoint, the reason that that's important is because the claim statement is going to help us see what issues should we be talking about and what issues are we not going to talk about. And so if there's problems with the language, it's not just going to be a problem of understanding the words, it's also going to be a problem of understanding what those words entail or imply regarding the shape of the whole rest of the controversy. To understand how this works, let's take a slightly less crucial proposition of controversy. Dr. Klien is good. Now, if you believe this, well, thank you. But if you're trying to assess the quality of this claim, it's got a problem, right? And the problem is in that last word. What does it mean to be good? It could mean that Dr. Klien is a moral person. It could be that Dr. Klien is an excellent player of Magic the Gathering. It could mean that he is tasty when served up with fava beans and a nice Chianti. Sorry for the Hannibal Lecter reference. The point is that good can mean lots of different things, right? We have a fundamental problem of ambiguous language, because if we don't know what is intended by the use of the word good in this claim, then how can we argue whether or not Dr. Klien is good? How do we establish for this value proposition what the relevant criteria are to determine whether or not Dr. Klien meets the standards that determine whether or not he's good? Now, let's contrast this ambiguous and therefore unhelpful proposition with an alternative. Dr. Klien is an excellent teacher. Now, what makes this a superior value claim? Well, it's in the precision of language, in excellent teacher. Now we've got something that is more focused, that is more specific, and can provide a good definition for the rest of the debate or discussion. What we're trying to evaluate is excellent teaching. So we can develop within the argument, right, what constitutes excellence in teaching? What sort of standards or criteria does someone have to meet in order to be deemed an excellent teacher? And then we can look into see whether or not Dr. Klien actually meets those criteria. So the clarity of the language is important, not just so that we can understand what the statement means, but also so we can determine how the rest of the debate is going to play out in terms of what the relevant issues are and how we're going to argue them. Okay, so the third criteria for an arguable claim is balance. This one can be a little bit tricky to understand if you're just looking at the definition. The requirement that the issues for and against a proposition be included equally in the propositional field. Now, ancient tutor are a little bit opaque about what this statement means, but if you think about it, all it really means is that we're able to discuss all of the relevant issues on both sides of a controversy fairly and equally because everybody has the same kind of equitable opportunity to have their positions heard equally. The propositional field really just refers to here is the realm within which we are arguing. Positions in support of the proposition, positions that are opposed to the proposition, and all of them can be included equally in order to be heard and assessed and compared so that we can make a decision. Now, if the proposition contains what ancient tutor refer to as connotative or prejudicial language, then the proposition would be imbalanced. In other words, one side would have an inherent advantage and the other side would have an inherent disadvantage. Take the following example with regard to a claim that is sometimes made with regard to the Affordable Care Act, sometimes referred to as Obamacare. Obamacare is an un-American policy that must be repealed. Now, you can probably identify already what the problem might be with regard to balance, but there's actually a couple of problems here in balance that also affect the criterion of clarity as well. First of all, let's take a look at this language. Un-American policy. The use of the words un-American here is a garden variety case of prejudicial language. Essentially, this claim, as it's worded, is set up that if you disagree with our position, if you agree that Obamacare is a good thing, you're not an American. And that's not fair. And that's going to make it harder for supporters of Obamacare to engage in this argument. But it's not just the prejudicial language that's a problem, and perhaps you've already seen this in the framing of this proposition. We've also got two things going on here. We've got a claim of value regarding Obamacare, the fact that it's, well, the assessment, not the fact that it is an un-American policy, something that you would have to determine through the stock issues of value argument, with the statement that it must be repealed. That is a course of action, and that is a policy claim. So what we've got here is what ancient tutor referred to as a double-barreled proposition. If you think about a double-barreled gun, like a shotgun perhaps, right? It's got two barrels that shoot two different projectiles. And so what you've got in a double-barreled proposition is a claim that's actually making two claims and not just one. And that's what this proposition is doing. It's making the claim that Obamacare is an un-American policy. That's a claim of value. And it's making the claim Obamacare must be repealed. which is a proposition of policy. Now, if you went with a simpler version of the proposition of policy, the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, should be repealed, we've got something that avoids the clarity problem of a double-barreled proposition that also causes imbalance in the proposition. Because in the previous example, Obamacare is an un-American policy that must be repealed, we've got not only a mess in terms of the criterion of clarity. What are the issues that we need to focus on? Do we need to focus on the value stock issues? Do we need to focus on the policy stock issues? How do we ultimately make a decision? But we are also really stacking the deck against supporters of Obamacare, because they're going to have to make the policy defense of Obamacare at the same time as not just defending the policy, but also defending themselves against the charges of being un-American, which is something that is really prejudicial and difficult to argue. By contrast, if you have issues with regard to the underlying value assumptions behind Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act, they can be and they should be addressed within the policy-focused, the Affordable Care Act should be repealed. But by focusing the proposition specifically on the policy question, then ultimately we can, as a judge or an audience to this debate, have a really clear sense of this is how we're supposed to decide this question. And the language is relatively neutral and objective. So it doesn't necessarily put the attackers of Obamacare or the defenders of Obamacare in a necessarily inferior position. Both sides to this dispute are going to be able to get their positions and issues heard fairly and equitably within the propositional field. So the language is going to make a difference, not just to make the decision more clear, but also to give both sides of the debate a fair opportunity to be heard and to have their positions weighed on the merits. The final criterion for arguable claims is challenge. Now, this is the one that gets a little bit tricky for some folks because at first glance, it's going to sound a lot like controversiality. Ancient Tutor described challenge like this. They say that a proposition or any claim has challenge if the arguer's claim confronts recipients' existing values, beliefs, or behaviors. So this idea of confronting something that somebody already believes or thinks or ways in which they act, well, this implies disagreement, right? So this is controversy. So what's the difference between controversy and challenge? Well, it's in those words, confronting the existing values, beliefs, or behaviors. So this is what Ancient Tutor are really driving at. Challenge involves not just controversy, but the following condition. If you are to accept the proposition, you are taking a position that is contrary to the status quo. In other words, present conditions, those beliefs or assumptions that are presumed correct until proven otherwise. So you can imagine, for instance, the following example. Present global warming trends are primarily due to human activity. Now, there are folks out there that believe that present global warming trends are not primarily due to human activity. So this is a statement that has controversiality. But does it have challenge? And the answer is, really, no. Because if we focus on the direction that this proposition is taking us, to accept the proposition, you are going to accept the fact that global warming is primarily due to human activity. And that is a belief, in fact, that is shared by over 97% of actively publishing scientists in the area of climatology, according to a recent webpage presented by NASA. So people may disagree with this statement, but it's not something that challenges the status quo, because the overwhelming scientific consensus regarding global warming and climate change is that it's primarily due to human activity. So this proposition does not challenge the status quo. The status quo, the primary assumption of the way things are right now, is defined by, in this context of disagreement, the overwhelming scientific consensus. So this is a statement that has controversiality, people disagree about it, but it doesn't have challenge because it doesn't require a significant shift away from the overwhelming consensus. Now, there are those who argue that this consensus of scientists across the world is wrong. And so there are folks out there that forward the proposition that present global warming trends reflect naturally occurring climate cycles. Now, this statement involves exactly the same controversy as the previous statement, right? What is the primary cause of present global warming trends? But the language here focuses on something that is very different than the previous example, reflecting naturally occurring climate cycles. Remember that the previous proposition that global warming trends are primarily caused by human activity is what is accepted by over 97% of active publishing scientists in the world. So to make this claim that the trends reflect naturally occurring climate cycles absolutely challenges the status quo, because it requires that if we accept this claim, we have to deny the position that's being held by most scientists all over the world. That is a proposition that not only has controversy, but also has challenge, because it challenges the currently dominant assumptions about this area of science. So, in order to keep these straight, here's how you can understand these criteria for arguable claims. Controversiality involves whether or not a point is under dispute. Is there significant disagreement on this point? If there isn't significant disagreement, if this is a point that most people most of the time are going to agree is true, then it doesn't meet the basic criterion of controversiality, and it can't be an arguable claim. Then we need to determine, is it clear? And the standard for clarity basically gets at this question. Can arguers and audience tell by the way that the claim is framed what issues are relevant or irrelevant? If the wording of the proposition is sufficiently clear that we can determine, okay, well, this is what it means, and so it's going to define these issues being relevant in the field and not these other issues, then we're in good shape. But if we have ambiguous language, or we've got something that's messy like a double-barreled proposition, it's going to violate clarity, because we're not going to really be able to tell what issues are we supposed to be talking about here. The third criterion of balance can basically be boiled down to this point. Can both sides of the discussion, the debate, or dispute fairly engage the issues? Are both sides going to be able to get their positions and issues heard in a way that's fair, in a way that's equitable, in a way that's going to get everything out there without giving one side or the other side an unfair advantage or an unfair disadvantage? And so what you want to watch out for here are things like double-barreled propositions or connotative or prejudicial language that's going to stack the deck in favor of one side and against the other. And finally, challenge. You want to keep straight the difference between controversiality and challenge. Controversiality is a more basic position. Do people disagree on this point? But challenge gets at this question. Does accepting the claim or accepting the proposition require changing belief in the status quo, the way things are right now, or the prevailing assumption of truth in this context of disagreement? So yes, challenge is always going to involve controversiality. But controversiality doesn't necessarily always involve challenge. All right, so to sum up this lesson, we basically are going to boil everything down to two really important ideas. First of all, propositions define the relevant issues, parameters, and responsibilities for arguers in a dispute. So those propositions need to be framed well. We need to know that controversiality, clarity, balance, and challenge are all present in that claim statement, in that proposition, because if they aren't, then we're not going to have a very steady sense of what are we supposed to argue about, what responsibilities do we have for establishing a case that can meet the burden of proof, and what are going to be the responsibilities for folks on either side. So that's the first important point. And because of that first point, we also really need to understand the second point, that different claim types involve different issue priorities and different responsibilities for the arguers in that dispute or debate. If we know that we're arguing a proposition of fact, or a proposition of value, or a proposition of policy, that's going to be extremely helpful, because that's going to let us know what issues are going to be relevant, what issues are not relevant, what are the stock issues that must be addressed by a prima facie case by the advocate in favor of the proposition, because if we don't know what those stock issues are, then it's going to be very difficult to make a sound judgment as to which side is right and which side is wrong. Okay, if you've got any questions or concerns about the basic concepts about claims and propositions in this lesson, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.